3 months ago, the top commander of U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan said he needed a few thousand more troops to break a stalemate in the 15-year-long war against the Taliban. Now, officials say the Trump administration could provide him with that manpower. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb explains.
With the arrival of warmer weather, the fighting season is heating up in Afghanistan. But the Trump administration has yet to announce its policy plans for the war-torn country.
No decision has been made, so let's not get ahead of what that ultimate policy will be.
But military officials tell VOA that policy could include sending a few thousand more international troops to Afghanistan. Leaders have previously tried surging international troop numbers to battle the Taliban, but experts say this tactical increase would serve a different strategy.
This time we are directly enabling the Afghan army, so we're trying to make that army more powerful, and so it's a different thrust than what we did in the past.
Officials say the administration's developing policy would focus less on international troop numbers needed and more on the capabilities needed, providing the resources for increased Afghan air power and special forces.
And joining me now for more is via Skype in Islamabad, VOA South Asia correspondent Ayaz. Hi, Ayaz. And also from the Pentagon, we have Carla Babb. Carla will be joining us by phone. So let's look at the facts, guys. We have 8,400 troops in Afghanistan now. Carla, how many more are really needed? I know you mentioned several thousand. I've heard upwards of 50,000 needed in order to stabilize the area.
Well, that's the funny part about asking how many we're talking about. We don't know until President Trump reveals his plan exactly how many are going to be asked for when the president goes to NATO, be them U.S. troops or be they troops from the international community. I have heard somebody told me 3,000 to 5,000 U.S. troops. Another person told me maybe 3,000 to 5,000 U.S. and international troops combined. This is something that I think President Trump has been keeping secret because they are working with their NATO allies to get that number, trying to focus more on the capabilities, helping to build the Afghan Air Force, helping to build the Afghan Special Forces, rather than just counting the numbers of international troops there. And General Joe Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had said earlier that the number will actually depend on the number of forces coming from NATO first. So I think they're trying to figure out that number, and then they'll come back to the United States, and President Trump will help decide how many U.S. troops are going to be there as well.
So, Ayaz, analysts have said that we need those numbers not necessarily to conquer the Taliban, but to bring them to the negotiating table. So could this actually tip the scale in favor of the Afghan government?
Well, I think that's what the leadership in Afghanistan has been hoping for, that it will buy them some time to really conclude the reforms in the security sector so that Afghan security forces are able to go on the offensive in this fighting season or maybe next year in order to put more pressure on the Taliban, to send a clear message to the insurgents that, let's talk, let's have peace talks, because you won't be able to win on the battlefield. But again, there is a lot of skepticism about whether it's 3,000, 5,000 or 50,000 troops, because we know that there used to be more than 140,000 troops in Afghanistan, and at that time the Taliban was not in control of even few districts. And today they are in control or influencing nearly 40% of the country's territory. So it is still, I think, more of a strategy to buy time, to enable the Afghan government to be in a position where it can improve governance and it can improve its diplomatic efforts to bring the Taliban, with the help of regional countries, particularly Pakistan, to the negotiating table to find an end to this protracted conflict in Afghanistan.
It's interesting that you bring this back to several years ago when we had so many more troops in the country. I've also heard that there will be no negotiating on the part of the Taliban. The Taliban says that it will just embolden them because they can consider negotiation surrender, and they say it's un-Islamic to negotiate. Is that what you're hearing on the ground?
Yeah, that's what this week they issued a statement, the Taliban, and categorically refused to have any negotiations with this current government. And I think they have been emboldened by the kind of support, alleged support they have been receiving from Pakistan and lately, from Iran and Russia. So it seems that it will depend on regional players who are behind or who are supporting the Taliban to really convince them and persuade them to come to the table. Because if it comes to the Taliban, they have now clearly taken this public position that any negotiations with the Kabul government would be un-Islamic.
So, Carla, what do you think? Will those regional players step up to the plate? And also, when the president meets with NATO next week, what will he tell them? And will NATO respond in kind with some more troops to go in, international forces?
I think that NATO is definitely in this for the long haul. I was with then Secretary of Defense Ash Carter last year at a NATO summit, and NATO committed to being in Afghanistan at least through 2020. There are so many things that are still needing development in the Afghan forces. The Afghan Air Force that I was mentioning earlier, that won't even be up and running until at least 2020. Because you have to start from scratch. You can't just make a pilot overnight. You can't just build a plane and get planes overnight. It's a very difficult process. But I think that the worry for U.S. forces and the worry for NATO forces, there are about 13,300 combined international forces there, is if there are more, will that make the U.S. and international forces more vulnerable? And will there be more casualties? And I think that we probably will see more of that because the United States, at least for their part, wants to go down further. Now they are supporting the corps level. They want to go down to the battalion level to help advise and assist because they say they're too far back to really be able to be effective with their advising mission. So that is the big worry here. That's what we have to look for in the future. Is NATO, is the U.S. willing to do that? And I think that they will be.
And we'll certainly be keeping an eye on that, especially with that meeting happening next week. Thank you so much for Ayaz and Carla. Thanks for joining us. We are taking another break now, but when we come back, the violence and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and how the United Nations is taking notice.